guys, welcome back to Spring Security course. So in last episode, we talked about these 2 points, user detail interface and the granted authority interface. So we talk about at high level like what they do, what they are exactly doing in the framework, how you can give your custom implementation, or you can use the Spring Security implementations. Okay. So now in today's video, we're gonna talk about on UserDetailsSvc and UserDetailsManager. Okay, so at high level, what we're gonna discuss is where this UserDetailsService and UserDetailsManager fits in the Spring security framework. Okay, we're gonna talk about this core component of Spring security in details. And let's start with the theory part. What is UserDetailsService and what it do in the Spring security framework? What is its role? So, is UserDetailsService is nothing but a interface, a contract which Spring security provides, and its only one responsibility is to fetch a user by a given name. Okay, so authentication provider majorly use this UserDetailsService to get a user which is who requested a request on the particular application. Okay, now UserDetailsManager. UserDetailsManager is a wrapper on top of UserDetailsService. Since UserDetailsService is having only one responsibility is to load a user from a source. What is source? Source can be anything. Source is something where your user data are stored, where your all the application data are getting stored. Those can be the source. Okay, you can link those source with the UserDetailsSvc. Now, so UserDetailsManager gives some extra functionality on top of UserDetailsService. So on top of only getting the user, you can actually create a user in that data source. You can actually modify some data of the user in that data source. You can delete a user from the data source. So those all functionality is missing in UserDetailsService. So that's why this UserDetailsManager comes into picture. When you have broader use cases of functionalities, then in that case we're going to use UserDetailsManager. Okay, and if our use case is very limited to only getting the user, and all the stuffs like creating, modifying, delete is handling somewhere else, then we're gonna make only use of UserDetailsService. Okay, that's why these two interfaces are totally separated out. Okay, ideally they can make in the same interface, but the reason to separate it into two interface is based on the responsibility. So one interface responsibility is to get a user. That's it. So in most of the modern applications, web applications, we have our own way of storing, updating, or deleting a particular user in our application. But when we are applying a Spring Security needs a way to get a user. For that purpose, they created this interface. Now, why they create a user detail manager? So instead, in many of the application, if you don't want to implement all the things by yourself, you want the Spring Security framework to handle it for you, then they have this user detail manager. There is already few Spring Security implementations are given like InMemory, LDAP, and JDBC. If you see here, we have InMemory, LDAP, and JDBC. If you have some requirement which has some different source rather than these three, then you can implement that user detail manager in a custom way, and you can have your own implementation of a manager who is managing the user on the Spring Security framework. Okay, so if you remember this figure from the last videos, so this is the figure that we're gonna reference here. If you see, a user detail is nothing but a representing a user, and user can have many roles. Okay, those roles can be represented using a granted authority in Spring Security framework. Okay. Now these two we discussed in the last video, and in today's video we're gonna discuss these two: user detail service and user detail manager. User detail service responsibility is to get a user, and user detail is a way to represent a user in a application, in a web application is a way to represent a user. Now, user detail service responsibility is to get a user. That's it. Okay. Now, if we want to have some more functionality on it, then we're gonna use user detail manager. Okay. How they're actually interlinked with each other via the classes or the design, I'm gonna show you in a moment. Okay. So let's jump back here. So what we're gonna do here? First, we're gonna discuss about user detail SVC. Okay. UserDetailsSvc, there is no custom implementation as of now. We have custom implementation of the user details manager, and those are in memory, LDAP, and JDBC. Okay. Since this user detail manager is on top of user detail service, so that's why we didn't need an actual implementation of user detail SVC. That is covered by these three already. Okay. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna create our own custom version of user details service. Okay, for that purpose, what we can do here, I created one package called service. There, what we're gonna do, we're gonna create a custom user detail service, and the interfaces it needs to extend is user details service. Why? Because as I repeated earlier many times, Spring Security doesn't know your custom implementations. Okay. And in order to let Spring Security know that okay, this is the custom implementation of the core component, we need to follow a contract given by Spring Security. Why? Because Spring Security doesn't know beforehand what type of implementation you gonna do. So that's why they created a set of contract so that the internal mechanism of a Spring Security keeps on working, because they have defined a certain contract in which certain methods, so that they are internally using only those methods, and at the end you are implementing those methods only. So that's why these contracts are there. So what we're gonna do, we need to give a custom implementation. So we're going to create custom user detail service class. Then I'm implementing this interface to follow a contract that is Spring Security provides. Okay. Okay, cool. Now, since following the contract that Spring Security provides, so Spring Security said, hey, I'm going to use this method load user by username. So whatever logic you want to write for this custom user detail service, make sure you write it inside of this one, so that I'm going to use this method for the authentication mechanism. Okay. So what it is saying, it is saying load user by username. So user detail service responsibility is to load a user with a given name from a given data source. In this case, right now, we're gonna keep the data source as in memory. Okay, in the later part of the videos, we're gonna change this data source to database, and we will see how things will change. Okay, what we're gonna do, we're going to create a data source, user data source. As of now, this will be the list data source, which is an in-memory data source. Now, what we're going to do is, first thing, when we are constructing this user details service, we need to pass this data source. What we did is, we created one data source, which is an empty data source. Now we created one constructor so that we fill this data source, empty data source, with some actual data. So what we're gonna do is, so what is our responsibility is get the user with this username from the given data source. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna iterate over our data source, stream it, and then filter the user with a given username. If we find any, or let's say if we find the first user itself, then what I'm gonna do is, if we find it, well and good. If we don't find it, just throw an exception, or else throw an exception. So since it is also expecting a function, so the exception should be this one. This is a Spring Security defined exception. Okay, username with user not found with name. Cool. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna provide the name also. Okay. So we can know, okay, which name we didn't find it. Okay, so Cool. So what we did, we have one responsibility to implement this method in order to follow the contract given by Spring Security. Because Spring Security is gonna use this method to fetch the user with this username. From where we are getting to fetch the data? From the in-memory data source. We iterated our data source. We filter a user with a given username. If we find it, well and good. If we didn't find it, we need to throw an exception. This exception is defined by Spring Security. Okay. So what exception we thrown? User not found with name. We given the name also for the better clarity. Okay, cool. Now, since we have our own custom implementation of user detail service, what we're gonna do? We're gonna make sure that this particular implementation gonna use should be used by Spring Security, not the default ones. So how we're gonna make sure? What we're gonna do here is, so these are the data, and we need to pass this data in a data source. So how are we gonna pass this data in a data source? So we'll talk about this in a moment. So first thing what we're gonna do here is we are creating a user detail manager bean. But since we are not talking about manager, we are talking about service. So let's create a bean of user details service. Cool. Okay. Now, what we're gonna do is we have two methods. Sorry. What we have two user. We have the data. Now we need to use this data in our custom user detail service. So what is our custom user detail services? Custom user detail, sorry, custom user details. It's not coming. I don't know why. Just a second. Let me just copy paste it. There is something issue with my ID. Sometimes it is not working. Cool. But since the constructor is not public, so it is not recognizing it. So we made it public. Cool. Now we have two users. We pass these users to the data source so that it can be saved into data source. And furthermore, data source can be iterate and get the data or throw an exception. Okay. Now application and check if Spring Security is using our version of user detail service or not. So what we're gonna do is, so I'm gonna test with this admin tool. So what we did, we tried accessing this API with a user that is given to data source, and we are able to hit the API. Okay. Now, so this way we are confirmed that Spring Security is using our own custom user detail service. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna check with some other user and saying okay, so what we did, we used some other user and check if our Spring Security is restricting the request or not. So it is restricting well. So what we did, so we talk about user detail service, what it do, how we can implement it in our own version of it, what things we need to follow in order to make sure that Spring Security uses our own custom implementation, what steps we need to do, how we can create a bean out of it, bunch of extra stuff. And then now it's time to go with the user detail manager. So user detail manager at high level is nothing but give some extra functionality on top of user detail service. So what we're gonna do, we have already three classes of for this implementation, user detail manager implementation. That is InMemory, LDAP, and JDBC. So you can go and check it out. What my main focus is to let you guys know about this user detail manager, how it fits into Spring Security framework itself, and how we can customize it. Okay, so let's let's go to the code itself. We're gonna create custom user detail manager. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna create custom user details manager, and in custom user detail service we implement a user detail service contract. But here, since we are going to give custom implementation of a manager, so we need to implement a manager interface. Cool. Now this is created. So if you see, user detail service gives us one thing to override, but user detail manager gives us bunch of method to override. Okay. So that's what I explained earlier also. User detail manager is nothing but it gives some extra bunch of functionalities. Instead of load user by username, it gives multiple bunch of other functionalities also. So if you go inside user detail manager, so behind the scene, it is extending user detail service. That's why this load user by username also we need to implement it, and all other methods too. Okay. So if you know about Java inheritance concept, you get to know how this functionality is flowing from one interface to another to a concrete implementation of the parent interface. Okay. Now we're gonna implement it. So what is the most important thing here is the data source. This user detail manager needs to talk to a data source. What is that data source? So as of now, for the sake of simplicity, we're gonna take this data source as a in-memory. In the later video, we're gonna take this data source as a DB database. Okay. Why DB? Because data stored in DB is persisted across the multiple applications reload or restarts. But the in-memory database, in-memory data source is not persistent enough because its life cycle depends on the life cycle of the program that you are writing. If the program or application reloads, your data source will be reloaded again. So it's kind of like a reset button. So if you press a reset button, everything is back to level 0 or the level you set. Okay. So right now we need to have a data source. Data source of what? Data source of user details. Okay. Sorry, not the user detail, the user. User of which type of representation of user is a POSO one, the custom implementation we created. You can also have a Spring security representation of the user. It totally depends on you. Okay. No, no. So user data source. We need to have whole. Now we're gonna make sure we set this data source in order to execute those below methods and test our API. Okay, so what we're gonna do? User manager. Cool. The first implementation is the load user by username. So the same thing, what we're gonna do, we're just gonna copy it. Just gonna copy it. What we're gonna do, we're just gonna get this user data source and add this user. Okay. So if you see, it is giving some error saying that, okay, you cannot save this user into this your own custom implementation of user. This is not, don't worry, this is nothing but a Java compilation checks. So what we are actually doing here is, this is our base one and this is our, so let's say, let's consider this is level 0 and this is level 1. We are one level above. And what we are trying to do to represent parent as a child itself. It should be not like that. So this is some Java issue. What we're gonna do here is just gonna do user details. That's it. So it's better to keep the parent interface everywhere for the update part. So for the update part, what we need to do here is this dot user data source dot add, and what we're gonna add here is user details existing user info. So we're gonna iterate over our data source. Just gonna stream it, and then we're gonna filter it. What we're gonna filter it is you via u dot get username equals user dot get username, and then find first. Okay, so we got, okay, so what we are doing here is we written some bunch of line of code. So what we are doing here is exactly one request came to update a user. How are we going to update a user? So first we need to check if this user exists in our current data source or not. If it exists, well and good. If not, just throw an exception saying user not found. Now what we're gonna do here is, since we got the user, now we need to update it. User class has these two fields, so we are expecting this to be never changed and only the password is changed. So what we need to do here is take the existing user info dot set password. Just a second. Oh, cool. In order to make this video shorter, what I did, I created one custom implementation of a user detail manager, which is implementing user detail manager contract. Why? Because we want this custom implementation to be used by Spring Security. So if you want it to be used by Spring Security, then Spring Security defines some set of rules inside this contract, which is we need to implement this bunch of methods. So we implemented it. So at a high level, I'm going to explain quickly what we did. So we need to have a data source so that our functionality will be working with this data source only. Okay. So at the time of creating this custom user detail manager, we are passing with some initial data so that this data source will be set up initially. Now, what we did first method is load user by username. This comes from the user detail service. So if you go inside user detail manager interface, internally it extends user detail service. So from here, this user load user by username is coming. Okay, cool. So we implemented it. So it is implemented. A create user is one of, again, uh, more functionality given by the manager, in which we are creating some user in our data source. So this user I'm expecting, and we are adding this user in our data source with some validation. So what validation we are going here to, we are doing two things. First thing is this user is of type user detail, and we have our data source as a user. So we are basically typecasting it. Why we are typecasting it? Because you cannot save parent, you cannot save this parent to a child one. Okay, because the child knows about parent, but parent doesn't know about the child. So the second method that we need, that we implemented is create user. Here we are creating a user with a given user. So here we add one validation. If a user is of type user itself, the custom user implementation that we have provided, okay, then only go ahead and save it, because this data source is of type user. Okay, so this typecasting is necessary only because when we are having an in-memory data source, this is, if you don't typecast it, Java compilation will be giving us some error. But now we are updating a user. Same thing, we are typecasting and we are added a validation if it is of type instance of user, our custom implementation. Then what we did, we stream our data source, we filter it. If we find anything, well and good. And if it is present, then what we did, we just updated a password, because right now if you go inside this our user class, there is only two fields, so we are expecting this name should be always there, and with this should be an identifier based on which other fields will be changing. Okay, in real world scenario it will be ID, but as of now, since we have only two fields, I'm considering username will be the identifier of a user. Okay, so we set a password with a new password. And now if we want to set another properties, we can set it if we have more than one properties. Okay, if not, if we didn't find any user with this username, then we're gonna throw an exception. Okay, cool. Now the delete user. So we are basically removing from our data source this user with a username. This is these all are the stream APIs, Java functionality. So if you are not compatible with it, you can write your own version of it in a Java 5 or a simple for loop, for each loop, and etc. etc. Okay. Now this change password. This change password, what we did again, we need this change password is nothing but we are updating the password same as it's here. We are doing in update user. So the same thing we are doing here. Now the user exists or not. Basically, it is checking if in data source we find any user with the username. Cool. So this is our custom implementation of a user detail manager. Now the major thing, how we gonna make sure that Spring Security use it, that it should use our own custom implementation of the user detail manager. So how we gonna do it? So for that purpose, we again need to go to project config. We need to make some changes here. What we have two users. Now we want this two user to be fetched to user detail manager, so that our data source will be initialized. So now we feed these two user in our user detail manager data source. So it is feeded. We are creating a bean out of it. Now, if you see, this is user detail manager and this is user detail service. So if you don't change it, well and good, there will be no harm, because if you know about Java inheritance, you can obviously have an instance of parent to be returned from a method where we are actually returning a child instance. Okay, so these all inheritance and stuffs you can learn in Java. Okay, or for the sake of simplicity and clarity, what you can do, you can have this user details manager. So what we're gonna do is here is what we're gonna have only one user, so that we know from the example if this current one is working or not. Cool. Let's go ahead and start our project once again. It's started. So let's check if the previous admin was still there or not. So this user is not there in our data source because we removed it and we have only one user, that is Kafur. So what we're gonna do here is we replace with the correct user and see password is 123412345. If we give a correct password, we are able to access an API. Okay, cool. So that's it. So at high level, we discussed today about user detail service and user detail manager. User detail service is only having one responsibility, is to get a user by username. That's it. On top of which, if we want some extra functionality, then user detail manager is there. We need to implement it. Okay. If we don't want our custom implementation, then Spring Security by default provides three implementation, that is InMemory User Detail Manager, LDAP, and then JDBC User Detail Manager. Cool. This also, please make sure to keep this in mind, that user detail service is user detail is nothing but representing a user in a programmatical way. The user detail service is using this user detail to represent a user, to return a user. User detail is again having some authority which is represented by granted authority. And now all of this user detail service is managing, is calling and all. So this ultimately user detail service is managed by user detail manager. Okay, cool. So yeah, so till now we completed these four. In the upcoming videos, what we're going to talk about is, right now we are having data source as in memory. In the next video, we're going to have data source as a DB. Then we're gonna create a fully fledged application in which what we do, we expose bunch of APIs from to create, delete, update, or modify a user, and bunch of other API to check whether we have a access or not on that API. Okay, so stay tuned for the next videos. Till then, bye bye, take care, and please do like and subscribe. Comment if you find any issues with my videos. If you are not able to understand any part of it, then I will be happy to explain it once again. Okay.